It has been 3 years since a British woman went missing from her American boyfriend's yacht, and her family and friends say since then, they've ended up with more questions than answers. We're breaking down this strange case with maritime attorney Michael Winkleman and Commander David Johnston, who is currently investigating the case. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. We have a very, very eerie, chilling story for you that we want to get into. 41-year-old Sarm Heslop, a former flight attendant from the UK, was sailing with her boyfriend Ryan Bane aboard this luxury catamaran called Siren Song back in 2021. He is reportedly an entrepreneur who had a successful business in Michigan, wound up becoming a charter boat captain. So she and Bane, they had matched on Tinder, they'd been dating for several months. They chartered the boat to tourists in the Caribbean, with Bane acting as the captain, Heslop cooking for the guests. And the couple was last seen together out to dinner at a bar on St. John's Island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And after that, they got back aboard the yacht, and Sarm was never seen again. Bane reportedly told local authorities that he awoke in the early hours of the morning, and she was gone. He contacted Virgin Islands police that night, telling them that her passport, her wallet, her phone were all still on board. They told him also to alert the U.S. Coast Guard, but he didn't apparently call them until the following day around lunchtime. And although Bane has always denied any wrongdoing, he didn't apparently allow his yacht to be fully searched by police and has never done an interview with them. That's what the reporting indicates. Now, the island was searched both on land and in the surrounding water, but officials say they couldn't go on the boat to search without a warrant, and the case was classified as a missing persons investigation, so they didn't have clear probable cause. We're going to get into that. Now, Bane was reportedly charged by the Coast Guard with obstructing law enforcement agents who boarded the catamaran. He allegedly stood in a doorway, told them they couldn't go inside, reportedly didn't have the proper equipment either, so they gave him a citation. That's being reported as well. The FBI alerted its agents that were posted in nearby San Juan, Puerto Rico about the case and started their own investigation. Very little has been released about what they found, if anything. And since Bane was neither a suspect nor a person of interest, there was nothing stopping him from sailing away, which he apparently did. Bane had previously been arrested and convicted in 2011 on domestic violence charges when he was married to his then-wife, Corey Stevenson. She told media outlets that after she heard about what happened to Sarm Heslop and that she had disappeared, she called U.S. Virgin Islands police and told them about his history, which included dragging her from a truck, hitting her head on the ground, and threatening to kill her. This is what Stevenson said. Stevenson has accused her ex-husband of having a kind of Jekyll and Hyde personality. Now, it's unclear where Bane had gone after he sold the catamaran, or allegedly sold the catamaran, but I will tell you that he was spotted at a Planet Fitness gym by his ex-wife's cousins out in Michigan. Meanwhile, Heslop's family back in the UK has started working with a private investigator named David Johnston. He's a former London homicide squad commander and hostage negotiator who agreed to work for them free of charge. We'll get into more about what Dave found, but I will tell you, a spokesman for the department told Fox News in an email that there were no new developments in the case and that all previously collected evidence has been shared with prosecutors. Family members told media outlets that as time went on, they were more convinced that Heslop was not just missing, but she's been murdered. Her parents, Peter Heslop, Brenda Street, they've said in a previous statement, quote, "We would like assurance that the authorities in the Virgin Islands are doing everything possible to find her and that the investigation into our beautiful and cherished daughter's disappearance includes a comprehensive fingertip search of the boat." Now, Mr. Bane hired a high-profile attorney named David Caddy, who previously represented Jeffrey Epstein's accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell. Caddy told Fox News that his client would return to the Virgin Islands if he was legally required to do so, adding, quote, "Mr. Bane had nothing to do with Sarm's disappearance and remains heartbroken that she is missing." Well, right now, I am joined by Commander David Johnston, the man helping with this yacht investigation pro bono, and maritime attorney Michael Winkleman. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here.
Dave, let me start with you. What is the latest in your investigation right now? What can you tell us?
Well, I think you've covered, Jesse, quite comprehensively the background. So for the last 15 months, I've worked with the family and been in communication with Ray Martinez, who's the chief of police on the U.S. Virgin Islands, and with Albert Bryan, who's the governor on the island. And we've been trying to negotiate with them, where I've agreed to come to the island and work with their investigators to see if there's anything that we can add value or understand more clearly for the family regarding what they keep referring to as an active investigation. Now, over that 15 months, the communication has been sporadic. There have been some promises to work with us. Those have later been recanted on or not followed up on. In November, they promised that the major crime team would communicate with me immediately, and I'm still waiting in March. And the last 7 or 8 emails, which I've sent on behalf of the family, I'm their advocate, to the commissioner and to the island governor, have been ignored. We've received no response, no communication. And
Wh-
indeed, last week,
Well, before we even get into last week, why do you think that is?
well, I've raised with them a number of questions which I'm happy to share.
Sure.
And those questions, about 20, are not comprehensive or completely inclusive, but are indicative of the things we would like to understand. Why was the boat not properly searched? And I'm sure Michael can help us with that. Why was there no forensic inquiries undertaken? Why was Bane not formally interviewed? Why was he allowed to leave the scene? There are a number of areas that are just not rocket science. They're just general good investigative practice. And candidly, we're at a stage now where we have to believe that this is incompetence on the part of the police, and it may be that because of that early incompetence and their failure to capture evidence at the beginning, they're reluctant to discuss this case. Look, these things happen. I've covered cases all over the world. These things happen. They happen in the UK and in the mainland US. All we would ask is that they please engage with us and help us to try to find out what happened to Sarm. And I can talk about Mr. Bane at a later stage. But we were told recently, this week, Jesse, that the matter had, and we found this out from a news outlet, we've had no official indication from the island police or the governor, but we're told that the case has been referred to the Attorney General. For what or why, we don't know.
Okay. We're going to get back to that in a minute because I know you've also made a very interesting discovery that I want to get into in a minute. But Michael, let me turn it over to you. So I guess the main question is why could authorities not come aboard the yacht and just search it and go, as the family has said, they want a full analysis of that boat. What are the complications here?
Well, unfortunately, it does sound like this was a comedy of errors, and I completely agree with the commander in his comments. And at this point, I think it unfortunately may be something of a lost cause. At the outset, I understand there was a refusal by Mr. Bane to allow his vessel to be searched. He was cited for that. So I think there was a number of errors at the very outset. And because of that, he then sells the vessel, and now the vessel's in the wind. Theoretically, if the authorities wanted to find the vessel and seize the vessel, they could, but that's like finding a needle in a haystack. I tried to use software that I've used in the past to try to locate the vessel. That was unsuccessful. So step one in even getting access to the vessel would be finding it, arresting it, and that's not an easy process. So
first let's talk about that. Why would it be? Why is it not readily available to find? I mean, is it not registered? We don't know who it's registered with. Obviously, I guess it's different than owning a car, right? But why is it difficult to find?
Very difficult, very different than owning a car, and very hard to find. There are GPS software on certain vessels. I mean, giant cargo ships, giant cruise ships, they have GPS, and they're very easy to find. In fact, they have to be found because of Coast Guard regulations. When you get to smaller private vessels, the regulations change and the requirements are not the same. Not to mention, if he sold this vessel, which would likely be the criminal's playbook, and in my opinion, that would likely be what would be done if someone did commit a crime and they wanted to cover it up. Could have been sold to someone in Russia, could have been sold to someone, in the Antarctica for all we know. And there's no regulations there that I'm aware of, being a maritime attorney, that require them to have their GPS tracking technology on. But even if they did have that, Jesse, there's an issue of, do they have jurisdiction or the ability or the power to, if they did find the vessel, to force the vessel to come back to the jurisdiction?
Right. That's a good point. And by the way, the side note of, would evidence even be there anymore if it was washed away or something like that? Let me ask you real quick, Michael, about this as well. I don't understand. Did they not have probable cause? I mean, they said that they didn't have the warrant, but you have a missing person. how do you not? I'm lost. How do you not have probable cause to say, listen, even if he doesn't want us on that boat, we should have the ability to go on. How is it that they couldn't get a warrant or they didn't have probable cause to go on there?
Jesse, I'm similarly puzzled. And my first guess would be there was a comment from the ex-wife about how he seemed like the dream guy at the outset. So my guess is when he first does an interview with the Virgin Islands police, he tells a whole song and dance. He's very compelling, says, boy, she probably went missing. I'm so worried. And they don't have any reason to suspect it, and they believe what he's saying. And because of that, they let him go. He does call the Coast Guard the next day. But again, by the time I think people are really in action, it's too late for anything to have been done. And then he hires this lawyer who is somehow related to Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And, lawyers of that ilk, they know exactly what they need to do to protect their clients. To me, the first thing that I thought of when I heard this case is where there's smoke, there's fire. And in my opinion, in my experience, all of Bane's conduct only leads to one conclusion, that there was foul play that was going on that vessel that evening.
So let's talk about that, because Dave, my understanding is you found something very interesting regarding a potential actions or potential path that Bane engaged in after this happened, after Sarm disappeared. Something about a freezer. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. So last year, I was able, and Michael's absolutely right, trying to trace this boat is very difficult because of the commercial size of it and the limited links to GPS or other equipment. That's not to say they're not on the boat, and we can come to why that might still be interesting from a forensic point of view, and why I still think this needs to be done. But yes, we managed to locate the boat last year with the assistance of a number of agencies that I work with, and that boat, we understand from our sources, had travelled to Grenada, and part of the cockpit of the boat was refitted. And we're told that that may have included a commercial fridge freezer on the boat. There's no indication as to why that work was undertaken, but I think, as Michael's already alluded to, there is no smoke without fire. Those are highly suspicious issues, in my view, and possibly an attempt to cover up the scene of a crime. And it appalls me that this man was allowed metaphorically and physically to sail off into the sunset, when in fact, I believe that had that boat been properly checked, compelling evidence may have been found to demonstrate that Sarm had befallen foul play at that early stage.
Talk to me about that forensic evidence you had mentioned, why you still think it's of evidentiary value even at this point.
Well, look, it's very difficult because, of course, we don't know what we don't know. I think Mr. Rumsfeld used to say that, didn't he? The unknown unknowns. But forensic is limited to a degree because Sarm Heslop was living on the boat, and you would expect to find her fingerprints, her hair, her DNA. One would not dispute that. But my experience, and I've had over 30 years of dealing with homicide in the UK and internationally, and until you've actually conducted that proper forensic investigation and looked for wet forensics, and that includes the traces of blood where you might not expect to see traces of blood, microscopic traces, blood spray patterns. We don't know what happened on the boat. But the problem is, by not doing a thorough investigation, you can't discount some of these hypotheses. And that's the purpose behind this. And let's be clear, it may also help Mr. Bane to prove his innocence if he tells us that nothing happened on the boat that was foul play. So there's that side of the forensic. The other side of the forensic, as far as we know, that's never been done, is the analysis of his cell site on his telephone to see where the boat may have moved to in the small hours, his itemised billing to see who he contacted immediately after the 2:30 notification of Sarm's disappearance. Who was he in contact with immediately afterwards? And indeed, you've heard that a number of items that were left on the boat are still with the island police. They've refused to give us access to those items, including Sarm's telephone and iPad. And they haven't, as far as we know, been forensically examined to establish whether there is anything. And there are a lot of things which can be done with the assistance of a number of agencies to look at what may have happened with those devices immediately before Sarm's alleged disappearance. So forensic takes many different layers, and that should be done. The analysis of the digital instruments on his boat needs to be done and undertaken to see if there's anything which demonstrates movement. An inventory of the boat Has he replaced things on the boat that may have been used? It's dreadful to discuss these things, but to weigh down a body. Did he buy a
Yeah.
new anchor? Why did he have the boat refitted? What was behind all of that activity? So forensics linked to effective investigation, none of which has been undertaken.
Michael, talk to me about the FBI here, because there's an interesting interplay between the FBI and the local U.S. Virgin Islands police. And as I mentioned, the FBI started their own investigation. Typically, in your experience, how does it work in terms of U.S. federal authorities getting involved in issues at sea?
So generally speaking, and where I deal with this all the time is with cruise ship passengers. So if there's a crime such as a rape or a sexual assault or a homicide at sea, if it involves a U.S. passenger, then the FBI has jurisdiction, regardless of where it takes place all over the universe, or all over the planet, that is. In this situation, it's interesting because Sarm was not a U.S. citizen. Of course, Bane is. But given the location of it being the U.S. Virgin Islands, I would undoubtedly assume that the FBI had jurisdiction. What they did, when they did it, that's an unknown to I think all of us at this point. But the interplay between the two of them should have been significant, should have been real. But again, I think the big failure in this case started at the outset. Bane was able to tell a song and dance that, for whatever reason, led the authorities in the Virgin Islands to back off. That allowed him to flee the scene with his vessel, sell the vessel. So much of the evidence is in the wind. I do think it's good news, and I was glad to hear from the commander that the attorney general is getting involved. Hopefully, continued media spotlight on a story like this will increase the investigation, actually lead to a prosecution, and hope that this family can actually get some answers to the terrible questions that linger with them 3 years on.
And Michael, just to ask your opinion about the Coast Guard here. First of all, I mean, I mentioned the fact that apparently Bane didn't contact the Coast Guard right away, but the Coast Guard cited him. They cited Bane. Again, it's being reported with obstruction. He stood in the doorway, told them they couldn't go inside. I spoke to Dave right before this about how it might have been also an issue if he didn't have the proper equipment on board. What can you make of that citation from the Coast Guard?
Well, the citation to me is troubling in that the fact that he wouldn't allow them to search the vessel didn't escalate it, or that wasn't reported immediately to the Virgin Islands or the FBI, because perhaps they could have then undertaken more. But to me, I am very familiar with this industry in the Caribbean, in particular, of charters and charter vessels. I represent people that are raped and sexually assaulted while they are working on these type of charters. And it's really an industry that is laden with drugs, laden with alcohol, laden with cocaine. So there's a lot of sordid things that go on in this type of industry. And I would be surprised if there wasn't some element of that. So the first thing that I thought when he refused to allow them to search the cabin was either something obvious related to Sarm's disappearance, but also something having to do with there being some type of illicit substances on the vessel.
Dave, let me close it out with you on this. How's the family doing?
Well, as you can imagine, and you've reported, I think, at the beginning, Jesse, they'd like to know what happened to their beautiful daughter. They are completely and utterly distraught. Distraught for two reasons. Well, for many reasons. Because Sarm disappears so suddenly and so unexpectedly. Distraught because nobody seems to care. The island police don't seem to care. The governor of the island, who's responsible, doesn't seem to care. And they're not communicating with the family or telling them what they're actually doing. So the family are left puzzled, angry, and upset with no answers. Of course, they've never recovered the body of their daughter. So in terms of being able to deal with that and grieve properly, all of these issues come into play. And I work with a charity here in the UK called Murdered Abroad, and we help UK families who have lost a loved one in a homicide abroad, because, of course, they get limited assistance from the UK police who have no nexus in the inquiry. We don't have an FBI type arrangement in the UK. So we help families, and I feel dreadfully for Brenda and Peter at the lack of communication and the lack of information that they've received. You mentioned, Jesse, earlier that a lawyer had indicated that Mr. Bane would return if legally required to do so.
Yeah.
Well, my message is very clear, Mr. Bane. If you cared about Sarm Heslop, as you say, it's not about your legal obligation. It's your duty and moral obligation as a human being to help the family. Return to the authorities and give a full account and tell people what happened on the boat that night. Give us some idea of closure.
And as I mentioned, he's already getting pressure from his ex-wife's family about this as well. And I'm sure as this is continuing on in the news, he might be forced to answer some questions here. I do want to ask you, Dave, to close it out. If people have information about this and they want to come forward and they want to help in some way, what would you recommend they do?
So the site where the great friends of Sarm who've been engaged in this to support Brenda and Peter for the last 3 years have a website called Justice for Sarm. It's moved from Find Sarm to Justice for Sarm, which is a recognition, Jesse, of the change and the understanding that the family have come to, that she has been subject to foul play and harm has befallen her, and that she's likely dead, murdered. And so that website, Justice for Sarm, will allow people to contact very quickly on the internet and provide any leads or any information. And if anybody has any information, then they should please reach out, contact us, and I can guarantee you that information will be followed up.
Well, hopefully a lot of people see this. Hope a lot of people look into this, and hopefully anybody with information comes forward because this family needs answers, and they deserve it. Dave Johnston, really thank you so much for the work that you're doing, especially doing it pro bono. Thank you for coming on to talk about this. And Michael Winkleman, thanks so much for explaining the law on this as well so we can make sense of it. Really appreciate you both.
Can I just say, Jesse, if Michael could be given my email address, it would be great to hook up with you on this, Michael, just in case we've got any more questions. So these guys have got my 100%. Email address.
Please
thank you, sir.
I actually have some ideas that I think we should chat about.
There you go.
Thank you, sir.
That would be great.
Look forward to it.